it's Anna Inacacho. I will be your host for today's show. I'm so excited and thankful that you guys came here to join us for the third ever Deep Dive show hosted by ARC.
And I'm Jeremiah. Thank you again for being patient with us today as we're experiencing some technical difficulties and restarting the show a couple times here, but we really appreciate you joining. I'm the co-host for today's show, and we got a great lineup today. We're going to first start talking about aversive racism with Adonai, and then Yabi is going to talk about why race isn't really real, and then I'll jump in with talking about critical race theory and why it's so important to understand.
We will also have a special and amazing guest join us today by the name of Donte Hughes, and we will have an amazing discussion near the end of our show, so make sure to stay tuned till the end. Now we will dive right into our three main topics, and we'll be talking about the first topic, aversive racism, right after this short break. So the first topic for today's show will be about aversive racism, as I stated. And I first figured out about aversive racism when I was searching through an article. Now, aversive racism is probably something that you haven't heard about because it's a really difficult concept to understand. Aversive racism is a really different type of racism than what you've probably heard of. It's a subcategory of racism that is more implicit than it is overt, and it does not deal with more hatred that's obvious to the eye. It's something that's subtle and indirect, and it's something that operates in the subconscious mind. So what exactly is aversive racism? Let me give you a definition. Aversive racism is a type of racism felt by individuals who support racial equality. So aversive racists support the idea of racial equality, but there's a catch. Aversive racists still have unconscious negative emotions in the presence of members of certain racial groups, especially in ambiguous circumstances. So now that we have a definition of aversive racism, let's examine the characteristics of aversive racists. In order to understand aversive racism, you will have to understand more about the characteristics of the people who use aversive racism. So we will look at three characteristics. The first characteristic that I want to talk about in order for you guys to really understand the concept of aversive racism is that aversive racists have unconscious negative beliefs. I stated this in the definition earlier, but you probably are wondering what exactly I mean by this. Aversive racists have unconscious negative beliefs that have been rooted in them through individual and intergroup factors. For example, these beliefs have been rooted in them through their childhood and through current and cultural stereotypes that have been built up over time for them to feel these racist beliefs. And these racist beliefs maybe have been rooted in them from their parents or maybe just people who they have been close to. The second characteristic of an aversive racist is that aversive racists don't show explicit hatred towards POC. Aversive racists show implicit racism, right? So instead of showing mean insults to others, instead they feel things like discomfort, disgust, and fear towards POC and other racial groups. And the third characteristic is denying personal prejudice. Now, I state this characteristic for last, not because it's least, but because it is the most important. And it's because it's a characteristic that I really want to dive deeper in order for you to understand the full point of aversive racism. So according to dictionary.com, the word aversive means trying to avoid or cause avoidance of a thing, situation, or behavior by using an unpleasant or punishing stimulus as in techniques of behavior modification. So let's focus on this first part. Aversive means avoid or cause avoidance of a thing, situation, or behavior. So we're going to use this definition to really understand the whole and main idea of the word aversive racism. So if we break down the word aversive racism, we keep the word racism and we change the word aversive to its real definition, which is avoiding or cause avoidance of a thing, situation, or behavior, then we get aversive racism changed into avoiding racism. So that is the whole point of aversive racism. It's people who continually avoid racism. If they avoid racism, how come they support racial equality, you might be asking? Well, more specifically, aversive racists try to avoid looking prejudiced. And they do this by denying any type of personal prejudice used against them. So they basically try to avoid looking racist. And they try to deny when anyone calls them a racist. Let's look into this closer. According to the encyclopedia.com, aversive racists have intergroup bias. So they have a strong belief that their racial group is better than others. Obviously, the definition of racism. So they have more positive reactions to white people than they do for Black people, making them avoid, like I talked about, being blamed of overt racial discrimination and protecting their non-prejudiced self-image. So another reason why aversive racists continue to deny that they are racist is because of the second characteristic we talked about, which is not showing explicit racism, but instead feeling things like discomfort, disgust, and fear. One of the main reasons why they try to avoid looking racist and try to deny when people call them racist is because they've had these individual and intergroup factors that have been rooted in their minds through their parents or people that through their childhood and through current cultural stereotypes. And all these racist beliefs have been rooted in their minds. So when people try to call out those racist beliefs, those unconscious racist beliefs, they start to get protective over them and they try to deny it. So basically, the whole concept of this third characteristic is that aversive racists want to deny personal prejudice because they want to protect their image and try to cover up those unconscious beliefs and negative emotions that they've been feeling since childhood. So what they will do in situations, what aversive racists will do in situations is they will try to not act inappropriately when racial discrimination would be obvious to others and themselves. So what aversive racists will do in a racist situation, they'll ask themselves, what is the racist thing to do and what is the not racist thing to do, right? And they will try to pick the not racist thing to do. And they'll try to not act inappropriately and not try to act inappropriately when racial discrimination would be obvious to everyone. But aversive racists can't protect their self-image for so long. In the book, The Psychology of Personal Prejudice, it says that discrimination in aversive racists will occur in situations which normative structure is weak, when the guidelines for appropriate behavior are vague, when the basis for social justice is ambiguous, or when one can justify or rationalize a negative response on the basis of some factor other than race. In these four situations, aversive racists will do something or say something that might harm another racial group because they can't necessarily identify the situations and ask themselves, what is the racist thing to do and what is the not racist thing to do? Because in these situations, the guidelines for appropriate behavior are vague and they can't really understand what they're supposed to do in these situations. But you may be saying, isn't that the right thing to do? You should be trying not to be racist, right? Isn't that the whole point? Well, let me explain this a little more in detail. As Dr. Abraham Kendi explains in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, he says, the opposite of a racist isn't a not racist, it's an anti-racist. Let me explain this deeper. So basically, when people are categorizing, aversive racists specifically are categorizing situations into not racist and racist situations, this is wrong because Dr. Abraham Kendi explains that since we live in a racist society, you're either going to be a racist or an anti-racist. There is no such thing as a not racist. There is no such thing as something in between these two. You're either going to be fighting racism, aka anti-racism, or you're going to be spreading it, whether you're doing it overtly or avoiding it and watching it pass by. So if somebody categorizes themselves as a not racist, they really are trying to be a racist, because the whole point of anti-racism is to fight racism and not to just be avoiding it and trying not to look racist. They feel the same way for the white and the Black student. But for the second infraction, you can see that essentially the teachers lost patience, and they lost patience, and you can see that they were more likely to recommend disciplinary action for the Black student than they did for the white student. So shown in this experiment, aversive racism is a concept that's really hard to depict in individual situations of racism in real life, because it isn't really something that you can spot when a person says a single sentence or in one single situation. It's something you really have to examine and see the pattern in real life. But don't get mistaken. Just because aversive racism is such a difficult topic, aversive racism is a very common topic in your life, and it is a very common topic in my life. I can see a lot of the time in my schools, teachers are most likely to have aversive racism occur, because teachers in schools, they always have maybe like posters on the corner of their wall that says like diversity, inclusion, equality. But in reality, teachers are not applying this in real life. They're just using this to say that they support racial equality, but in reality, their actions do not show this. Now, you are most likely to have some aversive racists in your life, because it is very common. Just to give you a few examples, it's that one person in your life who believes that all people should have equal rights, but then go on to say, I don't want to live in this neighborhood because of this specific race does this specific thing, or I don't want my son or daughter to date a person of that race, and etc. Just to give you a good overview of what an aversive racist is and how you can search for aversive racists in your life. When a person does not want to open themselves up to learning about racism and only says that they support racial equality, but in reality don't apply the idea of anti-racism in their life, calling themselves a not racist, trying to be neutral, not a racist or an anti-racist, that's when you can classify them as an aversive racist. Overall, it's individually really hard to tell if someone's being an aversive racist, because it's a concept that's really hidden. But once the pattern will show, you'll be able to see in action. Thank you, and I hope you learned something new. Now we will switch off to the next topic for today's show, which will be about how race isn't real, and it's actually just a social construct. This will be hosted by Afsara Yunakacho.
Now for the concept of race. The concept of race first emerged in 1750, and it was first called the Degeneration Theory. It said that there was an original and superior white race, and that it was this group of people that moved around the globe and mutated in different climates. Instead of explaining the pigmentation changes as an adaptation or the results of natural selection, they were explained as a deterioration of a higher archetype. This new idea of race became instilled as medical practitioners presented false evidence of African bodies that they dissected. They wrote articles about how Africans were damaged from living in tropical climates, that they had black brains, black bile, and even race-specific black lice. As we now move down the timeline, we can see that in the 1850s, mental illnesses were even created to explain the cause of slaves escaping. One of these illnesses is drapetomania, which was believed to cause slaves to escape. Another one was aethiopica, a type of lethargy that struck Africans who were not enslaved or overseen by any whites. Members of the pro-slavery lobby in the US even went as far as to say that African Americans were a different species. We see that as time moves forward, the jumbled perception of race only continues to grow as it becomes what we now see today. Now, although it has all been debunked, these Enlightenment theories are still embedded in people's everyday beliefs. Now, let me give you the real rundown of the concept of race. The truth is that race is just a social construct. The science of genes shows us that humans cannot be divided into biologically distinct categories. This challenges the traditional concept of different races of humans as biologically separate and distinct. According to the Scientific American, there is much diversity within racial and ethnic groups, as there is across them. The Human Genome Project confirmed that the genomes found in the globe are 99.9% identical in every person and are not race-specific towards any group. Now, the minor differences between ethnic groups are usually behavioral and linguistic, and are due to one's culture and experiences. An example of a culture that never used the concept of race to categorize people would be the ancient Greeks. Greek legends portrayed their heroes as multi-ethnic in origin. Being white did not exist in their minds. This can be seen in Greek mythology. Greek art, literature, and mythology often portrayed dark-skinned people with respect. Another reason we can consider that race is just a concept is the fact that everyone originates from Africa. Africans that eventually migrated began to adopt different skin colors depending on what part of the world that they lived in. In conclusion, the differences between races and ethnicities are not due to race, but rather what society has constructed. Race was only a strategy used to divide, rank, and control colonized people, and justify social, economic, and political inequalities. Radical beliefs said that behavior and physical appearances went hand in hand, meaning that they were genetically determined. Yet, this is not true. We know that physical variation is due to geographical areas. Skin color varies largely from light in temperate areas in the north to dark in tropical areas in the south, and that skin color does not depend on nose shape or hair texture. Scientists today find that these false beliefs of human differences in research have led to countless errors. People have the capacity to learn any cultural behavior. For example, the American experience with immigrants from hundreds of different language and cultural backgrounds who have acquired some version of American cultural traits and behavior is the clearest evidence of this fact.
Race theory has really rose to prominence in the last year as well, and it's made a lot of people extremely upset. And even as Columbia News of July 1st, 2021 reports, massive political figures in the US, such as Mike Pence, have said that critical race theory is racism. Also, Ted Cruz has said that critical race theory curriculum is, quote, every bit as racist, end quote, as the KKK. Cruz has said that critical race theory says every white person is a racist. And this whole concept of critical race theory, or CRT, has been popping up across school board meetings and city hall meetings all across the country and made a lot of people really angry. Yet very few people know what critical race theory actually is. So that's what we're going to dive into today. We're going to uncover what critical race theory is, why it's so important, and what it means for the world. So to start out with, critical race theory is basically a legal framework for analyzing laws and understanding how racism and the history of slavery and racism in the world continues to impact laws in the world today. It's not one body of literature, one book, one essay, or one scholar. It's a body of scholarship. It's a body of literature that's made up by a variety of scholars and by a diverse group of people. As the Atlantic of May 7th, 2021 reports, it really started to gain influence in the 1970s when Harvard law professor Derek Bell really started to analyze how race was impacting laws and started to lecture on this. At the time, he was the only Black professor at Harvard, actually the only professor of color at all. And eventually, he resigned from Harvard Law School to protest the institution not valuing race and not prioritizing it as a field of academic study. And after he left, Harvard Law School had no courses that dealt anything about race, and they didn't have a single professor of color. And so a group of students went to the administration and asked them what could be done about this, because they wanted to learn how laws were impacted by racism. And the response that they got was, what is so special about race in law that you have to have a course that examines it? Among the group of students that was told this message was Kimberly Crenshaw. And if that name sounds familiar, kudos to you. She is the person who coined the term intersectionality and has been a critical scholar in terms of racism and diversity, equity, and inclusion studies and intersectionality studies over the past several decades. Crenshaw and her fellow group of students invited a whole bunch of racialized scholars to come to their campus and discuss Derek Bell's book, Racism, Race, and American Law. And from that point on, critical race theory really just took off. The argument started to emerge among this academic body of literature that slavery, segregation, and discrimination are still embedded in our laws and continue to play a central role in preventing Black Americans from living free of racism. And when we follow this argument, it really lets us understand and start to address some racial disparities in our world today. For instance, census data shows that in 2019, the average home ownership rate in the US was 64.6%, and it differs by race groups. So for white people, the average home ownership rate was 73.3%, whereas for Black people, it is way lower than that, 42.1%. Additionally, the Fed of just October 22nd of this year shows that household wealth since 1989 has been skyrocketing for white people, yet household wealth in that same time period has stayed about the same for Black people. So because of that, wealth disparities and wealth inequities between Black and white people has continued to climb. And instead of just brushing these trends off as a collection of prejudiced people or a group of people who are stuck in the past and stuck in racist ways, critical race theory really forces us to analyze what influences could be factoring into these trends, these staggering injustices and inequities in our world. For example, as a peer-reviewed article from The Balance, updated November 23rd, 2020 reports, in the early years of Social Security, farm workers and domestic workers were excluded from receiving any pension benefits. And that was a lot of what Black Southerners did for work. So for a long time, for really a generation, 2/3 of Black people didn't receive a single dime in Social Security payments. So for a generation, white people were accruing generational wealth with their Social Security pensions, and their children were inheriting that money, whereas Black people didn't get any of that. And this is just one of the examples of how critical race theory, when we look at things like wealth today, critical race theory forces us to look back at how American history has affected our societies and institutions today. And as Crenshaw exemplifies also, it really forces legal scholars to ask difficult questions, such as, why does possession of less expensive drugs carry higher jail sentences than more expensive drugs? Could this have anything to do with how more Black people are in prison? And also, why is it that racialized people are more likely to be brutalized by police than white people? Could this have anything to do with how laws implicitly target Blackness or even non-whiteness? These are the questions that arise when we study laws through the lens of critical race theory. And it's really uncomfortable, but that's why CRT exists, to force us to ask these questions. And going back to wealth disparities for a moment, the Kinder Institute for Urban Research on November 24th, 2020 reported that between 1980 and 2015, the value of homes in neighborhoods appreciated on average almost $200,000 more in white neighborhoods than it did in neighborhoods of color. So between 1980 and 2015, home value appreciated a lot for all houses, but homes in white neighborhoods gained value on average $200,000 more than those homes would have been if they had been in neighborhoods of color. And when we look at this through the lens of CRT, it lets us see how a variety of factors influence this, including early valuation systems of property, redlining, and school funding policies, which are rooted in property tax and perpetuate segregated education, and so many more different things that factor into this massive disparity in home value. And so by analyzing problems through the lens of CRT, we can see how colorblind laws, or laws that don't explicitly mention race, have an enormous impact on race and racism, especially by hurting people of color. So by extension, because CRT lets us see the impact of laws and how they are racist, it also lets us see how we can dismantle that racism and start to break apart white supremacy through a legalistic approach. So in essence, critical race theory does a lot for our understanding of systemic racism. It lets us map white supremacy, analyze how the past impacts the present, opens a window to a more holistic teaching of history and law to include racism, and provides us a structure for deconstructing white supremacy in our laws. So then why does it cause so much controversy? Why does a Fox headline from November 10th of just this year warn that, quote, many of America's 50 most elite private K-12 schools teach critical race theory? Why is it being equated with anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and affirmative action policies, as if these are all horrible anti-American things. Well, the truth is that people are outraged because critical race theory is being taught in schools, but that doesn't really make sense. CRT isn't really going to be taught to K-12 students because it's a sophisticated, pithy body of academic scholarship that's taught in elite law schools. It's not going to be spoon-fed to elementary schoolers. And it's not like the ABCs or the times tables. So outrage over critical race theory being taught to children is just code for outrage over children learning about racism. And also, critical race theory isn't tangible. There's not one thing that defines CRT. It's not like one theory. It's a body of scholarship and literature. So on one hand, it makes CRT a really effective and really evasive, great boogeyman for people to point at and use to fearmonger. But in reality, CRT is comparable to like a department in a university. Saying you're against teaching CRT is like saying you're against teaching mathematics or communications. So arguably the main function of CRT is to expose and challenge white supremacy in an actionable legal way, right? So if CRT is attacking white supremacy, the only thing attacking CRT does is defend white supremacy. And this isn't just some Twitter debate. There are real stakes here in the CRT controversies. Critical race theory opponents are angry and they're increasingly organized. Their whiteness is ultimately under threat and they want to preserve their privileges. Anti-critical race theory leaders have done a really, really effective job at mobilizing and organizing people. And now they're running for school board meetings, for our school boards. They're attending city council meetings, going to places where they have power to influence what gets done. And to be completely clear, this is not a conservative versus liberal issue. This is a white supremacy issue. Attacks on critical race theory are more dangerous than just a few angry parents at one school board meeting. This is turning into a coordinated effort to defend white supremacy, and it needs to be stopped. Next, we'll be joined by Donte Hughes, a community organizer and activist based in Minnesota who's been pushing back against critical race theory protesters and fighting racism all around him for many, many years. Donte is an ARC member. He shows up to his school board meetings. He's on the District 112 Equity Advisory Committee. He's on the Chaska Equal Rights Commission. He's a leader of ROAR, Residents Organizing Against Racism. And he's one of those people who shows up, does work, and things happen. We're honored to have him join us today, and we'll be back to discuss with him in just a moment. So Donte, I guess just to kick us off, what are your thoughts on the things we've talked about today, on aversive racism, on why race doesn't exist, on critical race theory? How do these all come together, and what does it mean for our communities?
Well, I think both of you hit home with everything that you said. And you can actually see that in our own community today. And when I started speaking out at school board meetings, people didn't want to admit their racism. You know, it's so annoying when people say, I don't have a racist bone in my body. To me, that spells racist. If you have to justify not being racist, then you're trying too hard. If you're not racist, actions, words, delivery, everything, it'll speak for itself. But when you try to get everyone else to believe that you're not racist, it stands out so hard and so much. And that would, all of that it's been on display so much in our communities. And it's more frustrating now than it was when I first started, because there are more examples for people to open their eyes and just look at, to observe, to learn from. And they refuse to. And that's why I always call it intentional ignorance. Because purposely they are trying not to see the problem because they don't want to have to fix it. It's not necessarily up to me to have the conversations and to do what I've been doing. But I feel like I'm a good voice for it. I haven't done anything that anyone in the community has asked me to do. You know, I've took it upon myself, and I've kept doing it. And, you know, it's been rewarding, but it also has its moments. You know, everything has its moments. As far as CRT goes,
I know, right?
so you cannot claim racism for something that's attacking racism, which we also see. So if you heard about when the NFL was starting to do the Black National Anthem, people were saying, "Oh, we have one national anthem," which is racist, by the way. It was written by a guy who had slaves, but it was like, "Oh, that's racist." First of all, the Black National Anthem includes all. No words have had to be changed. You know, nothing has had to be reconfigured to sound appropriate. It was always that way. But the true national anthem, it wasn't that way. You have those people that want to uphold what I call America's policy, and that's racism. It's been here since the very beginning, and you can tell when there's a problem when we come out to speak against racism or fight against racism, and people attack that. But in the same sentence, claim not to be racist. They have a Black friend or their cousin married a Black person. It all just points out the racism. But it also shows the bigger problem and shows how long this problem has been here. You know, people feel like we don't have a right to speak up. They don't have a right to tell us that we don't have a right. With CRT, they say, "Oh, we shouldn't teach CRT, we should teach MLK." But they won't acknowledge that MLK was also fighting for the same things we're fighting for today. You know, they won't acknowledge that MLK protested, which they don't want us to do. So which part of Martin Luther King Jr. they want us to teach, I'm not sure. But nothing about Martin Luther King fits their narrative. And that's what they're neglecting to realize is their hypocrisy in like their own words and actually speaking it. It just lets us know like how much they haven't learned about Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
They can't tell us beginning, middle to end. You know, they can't tell us what type of life Martin Luther King lived at the end. What kind of life Martin Luther King lived at the end. All they want us to see is peaceful. Now, I'm a peaceful person, but I am no Martin Luther King. I will not portray to be, and I also won't let anybody attack me that way either. I take my hat off to him for being able to withstand that and still be able to go and preach his message. That's strength that I just do not have. But it's amazing strength to be able to go up against that each and every time. And people tell you that you don't have that right. When we first started going through racism here in Carver County, people were saying like, "Oh, we've given them everything." If we really want to look at history, it was the opposite way. You know, the people that was in the fields did the work. They didn't push it off on anybody else. They couldn't. But what people also don't know is that a lot of slaves lost their lives fighting back because their wives and kids were being raped and taken from them. So while we're made to look like the criminals, America has always been a criminal in each and every sense of the word. And that's what scares people about CRT. is having to live up to that truth that's been hidden for so long. But it needs to come out. If we're going to teach history in school, it should be accurate. If not, we shouldn't teach it at all. And it's not several different accounts of history. History has already been rewritten, and it needs to be written right. And until we get to that day, or until I get old, well, I'm already great, but until I get old and can't speak anymore, I'll keep fighting for that, because kids, not even Black kids, but other ethnicities are also not being taught their culture as well. We have an extremely white history, and it's made to seem like everything has been all good all the time. And it hasn't been. It's never been. It's not to this day. We just had a president who would uphold white supremacist groups. But every time something go wrong, he would blame Black people and Antifa. Like we are, one and the same. And we're not. And people latched onto that. People talked about me protesting, and this is personal. People talked about me protesting, but literally had no problem with January 6th. And then they also flipped how they felt about Black and Blue, because that was out the window as well. And the lady that died, and I pray for her family a lot, because I've seen enough death in my life, and I don't want to see anybody go through that. I don't want to see families go through that. So I pray for her family a lot, but there's no way to call her a hero and condemn Black Lives Matter at the same time. They're not even the same thing. We haven't stormed and tried to take any buildings. And most people even neglect the fact that some of the protests that turn into riots are not even started by the people that's protesting. We're made to be the bad guy. And like sometimes we're okay with it, because America needs that bad guy. But what America can't answer is, why are we the bad guys when laws have been created against us? Even when the Declaration of Independence, it's like, why is that even a thing? And there were still slaves here. Whose independence is it? How can we uphold anything of the forefathers when so much of it has been used to attack Black people? The war on drugs, Black people. When racism was abolished, people still had slaves. Everything that they worked for in those fields, they weren't given anything. They should have been the rich ones, but they weren't. And even the 14th Amendment, I don't agree with that either. To me, that was something for them to say, it's like, we gave you this, so be quiet. No, absolutely not. If anything is for everyone, nothing should be need to be added so that it's for everyone. If that's the case, tear it all down and make it inclusive for everyone. But people are afraid of that because they feel like we want something that they have. We don't. The power that they believe they have is false. The security that they think that they have is false. It's like the kid in Wisconsin. There's not a Black person out there with a gun like visible. But here you have this kid that has a gun to make sure nothing happens to the community.
I just want to confirm, jump in for quickly. This is Kyle Rittenhouse, who shot at Black Lives Matter protesters in Kenosha, was it? During the last year, and was recently exonerated and basically set free for acting out of self-defense, which is ridiculous. Sorry, Donte, continue.
And it is ridiculous. You know, when you come to something that have absolutely nothing to do with you, with a gun, and like the police officers are giving you water, and you know, they're basically telling you that it's okay.
Mm-hmm.
That whole time, you're the aggressor. You're antagonizing people that's out there protesting for something they feel strongly about, which none of them can understand. And they don't even want to. But him being exonerated, it was what I say, America's policy held intact.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's the way that it's supposed to be. When the presidential elections were going on, you saw people protesting and yelling, and everybody got assault rifles, all type of guns, and they're yelling at everyone. But when we want to have a simple protest, don't bring that here, or we can't have looting here. It's like, first of all, we live in Carver County. No one is looting here. No one has looted here. The only way it's coming here is if you keep bringing it up. Almost like CRT that people keep yelling about. I don't know what make people think that it's in our schools being taught to people that wouldn't even fully grasp the concept right now. Or they might better than adults do.
That's true.
I'm starting to believe that the younger generation have a better grasp on racism and how things should be than the older people. And it's not that the older people don't have that knowledge. They don't want it. They want to keep the good old boys club just nice as and perfect as it always been. And one day, it's like that good old boys club will not exist. I don't care what it'll take from me to give, but until all of my kids and your kids, when you have kids, not the two ladies, they're not allowed to. But when everyone has kids, and we're all different backgrounds, different cultures, and when we are all safe in one place, that's when I might quiet down a little bit. But until then, we can't afford to get quiet anymore. It's like we've been quiet long enough. And without those voices, without our voices, it tends to go back to the way it was, the way it always has been. And if people don't see that as the problem now, eventually they will, because more and more people will understand, will look up, and will start to speak out. And eventually the good old boys club will be silenced. That's just what I believe.
Thank you. I just want to add on to that, onto what you kind of said, and I want to agree with you. Everything you said, I really resonate with, especially since I live in Carver County too, in Chaska. And the things you've said about school and history, I definitely agree with that, because more than once I've had to correct my history teachers because they've been teaching the wrong history. For example, my family's from Ethiopia, and in 6th grade US history, they were teaching a wrong history about Ethiopia, saying that the Italians actually conquered over Ethiopia, but in reality, Ethiopia is actually just It was always in the country. So I had to correct my history teacher. And he told me, oh, I'm just teaching from like history books. Like that's what the history book says. So I'm going to teach it. And then after that day, I always wondered like, so if this is fake, like what else am I learning that's fake? You know what I mean? Like, could this be fake? Could this be fake? So from that day on, I started like learning my own type of history because I really couldn't rely on like what my teachers taught me in history. And recently, when I was, I'm in ninth grade currently right now, the same thing happened with my world history teacher where me and my friend had to correct him on what he was teaching about slavery. So at this point, I'm kind of thinking, like, are the teachers like hiding something from me? Like, you know, so I feel like it's really important to like what you're saying about like critical race theory and that you're fighting for this because it is a really important topic. So thank you.
Good for you. Keep pushing back because, well, no one can tell you about your own history and heritage and where you come from better than you can, especially not over here in the States. And I have to look more into this, but if a lot of curriculum is coming from like Texas or something, that explains a lot. But it's time to redo it. It is time to redo it. There's way too much diversity in this world for us not to be teaching for everyone. It's like we're not focusing on what I used to tell people who have been critical race theory, teaching on one side of the agenda. That's what we've been doing. That's what's been here this whole time. And if people are afraid for the truth to be out, then it's just too bad. It's just too bad. You can't educate teaching lies. And it's been going on way too long. You cannot educate teaching lies. It's a false education. You'll hear parents now with masks. Masks are like the worst thing in the world. Since when? It's like you have people in occupations that have been wearing masks day in, day out, all day long, for years. But now all of a sudden these masks are so much of the problem. How so? I actually haven't felt my allergies until I took off my mask this year after I got vaccinated. Since COVID, that was the first time my allergies had bothered me. And I can't say for sure it was because I had on a mask, but I didn't see as many people like with colds or sick. But we also wasn't spreading germs from one person to the next. Going to any supermarket, store, restaurant, and watch one person sneeze. They won't cover their mouth. It's disgusting. It is disgusting. And the mask like kept all of that to themselves, which it should be anyway. I wish they was raised by my mom because you get caught doing that in public, that's gonna be a problem. But I have no idea like what people decide to fight for, you know. And I went to Victoria Elementary and read books to 2 classes. And a lot of things that the parents saying are lies. You know, I asked kids were they happy to be in school. Of course they were. You know, every kid wanted to be in school, especially after last year. I asked them if they liked wearing masks. And a lot of them said no. And I agree with them. I didn't either. But they also understood. They was able to have fun. They was able to enjoy their peers, their teachers. Those kids had fun. They wasn't thinking about masks at all being a problem. And parents need to stop forcing it on their children. That's why we're seeing a lot of problems. People will force that on their kids, but they won't teach them not to be racist. They won't teach them how not to have those acts of racism that we're seeing just this morning. You know, I hate Negroes. And we're tired. we're past fed up. And then not only are we fed up, we're doing a job that we didn't not necessarily sign up for, but we didn't create this problem. There's no reason for racism to actually exist unless it was coming from the other way. It's like we were the ones lynched on trees. We couldn't look at white women or use white bathrooms or use white water fountains. It's like everything was created against us. And if you take a poll in Carver County today, we'd be surprised about the numbers that would love for it to go back that way. And sorry for them, but if that's what they want, what they say, oh, just stay in the house, don't come outside, for COVID. Don't come outside, stay in your house, stay in your bubble. But if you come outside, there is no space for you and you alone. Every space that we come in contact with each other will be shared, and that is not an option. We've made it an option for too long. Even I'm guilty of it. I would not play my music, or I would try not to be so aggressive or sound aggressive, but there's nothing that I could do to satisfy that. There's nothing I want to do to satisfy that. I am who I am, and I love me. Humanize my hoodie is something so simple, but it's literally, it have been a criminal act when Black people have on hoodies. We look different. But what race does not wear hoodies? But we're the only ones that fit the profile with a hoodie. There's this guy at work, he's like 6'6", he has dreads, he's this big dude. And, I told him, I say, there's no reason why I should fit your profile. But no matter what, if somebody want me to fit your profile, I always will be. I always will fit it. And vice versa. I don't know how he shrink himself to like 5'7" or 5'12", 5'7". But no matter what, we fit the description of each other, no matter what. Philando Castile, it was reports that his nose, that makes no sense to me. You recognize he looked like somebody by his nose? That doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't make sense that I would look like anybody other than who I am. And I get told I look like a lot of people, so it's kind of annoying. But I can't fit just any profile. People are glad to say when victory is held up against a Black life. The cost of a Black life has been cheap, but it's not. It's priceless, like everyone else's. And we're not going to allow it to be cheap. We are not going to allow people to continue to get no sentences or barely even looked at. There's been so many cases recently with community members who felt like they can be judge, jury, and executioner. And then we have police that's in the same boat. You don't have us chasing other races. The only thing a Black man fear is probably another Black man, because we know what we are capable of. We know how strong we can be. Other than that, we're not afraid of anyone else. Anyone else. And to me, that's what racism is. We couldn't be controlled. We created our own way. Grew our own neighborhoods, airports, you name it, we had it. And America didn't like it. So they took it away. White people didn't like living next to Black people, so they built highways and They did everything to segregate and divide us. And people say that talking about race is what divides us. That's impossible. That has already been done, and it continues to be done. Coming from Chicago, I see the resources that are in Minnesota that aren't in Chicago. And then coming from North Minneapolis to Brooklyn Center, you can see the change there as well. And from Brooklyn Center to Alaska is like night and day. You don't get that in Chicago. It's like, you don't get me coming to the school in Chicago to read books to 2 classes of kids. They don't want that to be shown. And any Black person that does what I'm gonna call him my uncle. What my uncle Donte is doing, and what I'm doing, we are a threat. We are a threat. And for what? You know, it's not even that we're trying to be heard. We will be heard. We will continue speaking. We will continue doing what's morally right, because America has been morally wrong from the beginning. It continues to be. And until it looks itself in the mirror and have that conversation, we got to keep putting that mirror back in its face.
Donte, I want to jump in real quick. We only have a minute or 2 left. So to the people who are watching, what do you have to say for like a final send-off, call to action? What can we do with all this? We've covered a lot of ground here and touched on a lot of different topics, but where do we go from here, really?
As for me?
Yeah. Sorry, I know that's, you said you wanted hard ones.
we continue to build. You know, we continue to have those conversations. But also, like I tell people, I'm not going to force anybody to believe in white privilege. You know, that's not something that I want to do. But I will keep showing the differences of how it is. But we keep building relationships. I said a while ago, I don't want to change minds. I want to change hearts. We keep going for that because there's more people that we can touch that way. There's more relationships that we can build that way. And we will. And over the last, 2-3 years, it's been evident that we do build relationships that way. We have gotten better and more people are speaking up, but we need more.
Well, to everyone who's watching, you can be the people who are more. You can speak up. You can go to school board meetings, go to town hall meetings. You can start stepping up and speaking out in every part of your life wherever you can, because none of us are doing enough as long as racism still exists, and we're still in the heart of it. It's still very much here and very much here to stay. So yeah, we have a lot of work to do, especially white people, those of us who caused this massive infestation. So for those of you who are white who are watching, especially, please do what you can to take it upon yourself and change the people around you and build relationships with the heart. Don't just slap people with facts like Donte was saying. So yeah, thank you all for joining us again today and enduring with us through all these technical challenges. Maybe the windstorm that is blowing throughout Chaska is having some issues with the internet or something. We're not sure what's happening, but thank you for putting up with it with us. Adonai, do you have anything else to add before we go out tonight?
Nope, I just want to say thank you guys for watching, and thank you so much, Donte, for coming to our show and giving us such good information for the audience and for us too. Anytime. Yep. Thank you guys for bringing me.
Yeah, of course.
Yep. No problem.
Pleasure to have you. Well, we appreciate you all logging in today and watching the show, and we will see you for our next show in the new year.
Yep. See ya.
Bye, everyone. Are we off?